I never saw it coming. I thought our life together was perfect, solid, unbreakable. Caleb and I, we were everything to each other. Or so I thought. Our love story was the kind of thing people envied. We'd met in college, grown together, laughed together, and built a future. He was my best friend, my partner in everything. When I first noticed the signs, I didn't want to believe them. It wasn't a grand betrayal at first. No screaming matches, no yelling, just a small thing. A little moment that didn't mean anything. At least, that's what I told myself. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't trying to find out anything. But it happened anyway. Caleb had come home late, as he often did these days, his usual excuse being work's been crazy. I was sitting in the living room, half watching TV, half waiting for him to walk through the door. He was tired, his movements slow, almost distracted. I didn't think much of it. We all have those days. It had been a long day for both of us, but there was something different. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it. When he walked in, he didn't even greet me right away. He dropped his bag, unbuttoned his coat, and rubbed his eyes like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. I didn't say anything at first. He was clearly exhausted, and I knew better than to ask what was wrong. It had been a pattern for a while. But then, just as I was about to ask him if he was okay, I heard it. He was muttering something under his breath. I thought he was talking to himself, maybe complaining about his day. But then I heard a name. Alice. Alice wants me to stay. I don't know. I can't keep doing this, but I need to. I froze. It was like the world stopped for a second. My heart pounded so loud I couldn't hear anything else. Who the hell was Alice? And why did it feel like I wasn't supposed to hear that? I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to ask him. But I had to. I had to know. I tried to act like I didn't hear it. I kept my face neutral, but inside I was dying. And the worst part? He didn't even notice. He didn't even flinch. He just kept talking to himself like he wasn't standing in the same room as me. That name, Alice. It echoed in my head all night. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. I just kept replaying that moment over and over, the way he said it. It was nothing, like it was so casual, but my heart couldn't let go of it. Alice. The next few days were like trying to breathe underwater. The air felt thick, and every second was harder than the last. Caleb was here, but not really. His presence, once comforting, now felt distant, like he was standing just out of reach, and no matter how hard I tried to pull him back, he was slipping further away. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe I'd misunderstood, that I was reading too much into it. People said that sometimes how the mind can make you see things that aren't there, make you hear things you wish you hadn't. But something inside me knew that what I heard wasn't an accident. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. Every time Caleb left his phone out, I'd glance at it. I told myself I wouldn't, that I didn't need to know. But the urge was overwhelming. I couldn't help it. I was drowning in the unknown. It was one of those quiet, ordinary mornings. Caleb was in the kitchen making coffee, humming softly to himself. His phone was lying face up on the coffee table. I stood there for a second, torn between the need to know and the fear of what I might find. But the curiosity gnawed at me until I couldn't resist. I walked over. My hands felt numb as I picked it up. And there it was. Alice. A name, a message. Alice wasn't a work colleague or a casual friend. No, she was too familiar. I miss you. We need to find a way to make this work. I can't wait for this weekend. I stared at the screen. My heart sank into my stomach. I didn't know what to feel. Anger, fear, betrayal, or just emptiness? I put the phone back and walked away, my pulse loud in my ears. I wanted to scream, to throw it all in his face, to demand answers. But instead, I stayed quiet, sitting on the couch as if I hadn't just uncovered the worst part of my life. Caleb didn't notice. Not when I glared at the wall, my hands shaking in my lap. Not when I stared at him, unable to speak. It felt like the world was shifting, tilting in a way I couldn't stop. But I didn't say a word. I couldn't. I didn't know how. How could I even start to ask? How could I ask about Alice, about them? It took everything in me to ask him about it. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to hear the words that would break me, that would turn everything upside down. But I couldn't stay in the dark anymore. I couldn't keep pretending like I hadn't seen the message, like I hadn't heard the name. It was a Thursday evening. Caleb was sitting across from me at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. The light from the lamp above us cast long shadows across the room, making everything feel too heavy. The silence between us felt like a weight, suffocating and thick. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, but it felt like it was going to choke me. "Alice," I said, barely above a whisper. My voice was shaking, and I hated how weak I sounded. I hated how fragile I felt, like any moment I might crack in front of him. But I couldn't stop myself. "Who is she?" Caleb didn't even look up from his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen, clicking mindlessly, like I wasn't even there. But then he froze. The room was too quiet. He knew. "Alice?" he asked, his voice too calm, too casual. He knew what I was asking, and he was stalling. But I couldn't stop myself now. "Yeah," I pressed, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to make it sound like I wasn't falling apart. "Who is Alice, Caleb? Why does she mean so much to you?" He sighed, like he was frustrated with me for asking the question, like it was a burden he didn't want to carry. He set his phone down and finally looked at me, but there was something cold in his eyes, something I didn't recognize. "She's just a friend from work, Maya," he said, his voice smooth, too practiced. "You're overthinking things. She's nothing." I could feel the lie wrapping around his words, tightening with every syllable. It wasn't just the way he said it. It was the way his eyes didn't meet mine. The way his voice faltered at the edges. I didn't buy it. "I saw the message, Caleb," I whispered, trying to steady myself. "I saw it. I know what she means to you." For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't regret. It was fear. Fear that I might see through him, see what he'd been hiding all this time. He laughed, a dry, hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Maya, you're making a big deal out of nothing. It's just a message. You're overreacting. You always overreact." His words hit me like a punch to the stomach. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't confessing. He was gaslighting me. And I hated it. I hated how he made it feel like I was the one losing my mind, like I was the one who couldn't handle the truth. But I wasn't crazy. I knew what I saw. I knew what I heard. And in that moment, I realized something. Caleb wasn't just hiding a secret. He was protecting it. He was protecting her. And it crushed me. "I'm not overreacting," I said, my voice shaking with the weight of it all. "You're lying to me. You've been lying to me. And I don't know why." Caleb didn't respond. He just stared at me, his face unreadable. The room was suffocating. I wanted to scream, to throw everything I had at him. But I couldn't. I was too broken to do anything but sit there and wait for the truth that was never going to come. I didn't sleep that night. Not a wink. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of Caleb's face flashed in my mind. His cold, unfeeling eyes, the way he denied everything, the way he made me feel like I was the one who was broken. I couldn't stop thinking about Alice, about how much she meant to him, about the way he lied so easily, like it was nothing. The silence between us stretched out for days. Caleb was still here, physically, but emotionally he was a million miles away. Every conversation we had felt like a chore. Every word we exchanged was like a cut deeper into my chest. But I couldn't just ignore it. I couldn't pretend I didn't know. I needed answers. It was that Saturday morning when it all came crashing down. Caleb had left early, as he always did on weekends. I told myself I was just going to let it go, let him have his space, let the anger settle, and pretend like everything was fine. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't pretend. I grabbed his jacket from the closet, the one he'd carelessly thrown aside when he got home late the night before. I wasn't looking for anything. I didn't want to go looking through his things. But when I pulled the jacket out, a small piece of paper fell from one of the pockets. It was a receipt for a hotel. And not just any hotel. A place I knew well, one Caleb and I had stayed at on our anniversary. The date on the receipt? It was from just last week. The same week he had acted like nothing was wrong. The same week he told me I was overreacting. My hands shook as I read the details on the paper. The receipt was for a weekend stay, a room for 2 people. I didn't have to ask who it was for. I knew. I could feel the blood draining from my face, my head spinning as everything I had been trying to deny came flooding back. I didn't have to ask him. I didn't have to confront him again. The evidence was right there in my hands. The truth had already been written. The weight of it hit me like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just the affair, it wasn't just Alice. It was the fact that Caleb had planned it. Every lie, every secret was part of a plan. He'd been hiding it from me, from the start. And worse, he didn't care. I sat down on the couch, staring at the receipt like it was some foreign object. My heart was in my throat. I didn't want to cry, but I couldn't stop it. I had trusted him. I had given him everything, and he had thrown it all away. I didn't know how long I sat there. Time felt like it stopped. But I knew deep down that the person I thought I knew, the person I thought I loved, was never really there at all. When Caleb came home later that day, I was sitting in the living room, still holding the receipt. He looked at me like nothing had changed, like we were still fine. But I wasn't fine. And I never would be again. When Caleb walked through the door that evening, I didn't say a word. I couldn't. What could I say? The silence between us was thick with everything that had happened. My heart was still racing, my hands still trembling from the receipt I was holding. But I stayed still, didn't move an inch. He walked in like everything was normal. He didn't notice the receipt on the table at first, didn't see the way I was staring at it, barely able to breathe. He just took off his coat, set down his bag, and made himself a drink. "Hey," he said casually, his back turned to me. "How was your day?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout at him. How could he act like nothing was wrong? How could he be so cold? But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I stood up, slowly, my whole body shaking as I held out the receipt. "Caleb," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What is this?" He froze. For a second, there was nothing, not a sound, not a movement, just silence. And then he turned around. His face went pale, his eyes widened like a deer caught in headlights. But he didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the receipt like it was the last thing he ever wanted to see. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice cracking. There was no apology in it, no regret, just panic. I didn't need him to answer. I already knew. "Alice," I said, my voice shaking with the weight of it all. "You and Alice, you planned this. You've been planning it." He opened his mouth to say something, probably to lie again, to make up another excuse. But I couldn't listen to him. I couldn't hear the lies anymore. "I'm not stupid, Caleb," I said, cutting him off. "I saw the messages. I found the hotel receipt. I know what you've been doing. I know everything." His face changed. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't sorrow. It was anger. His jaw clenched and his eyes narrowed like he was preparing to fight, to argue. But there was no arguing with the truth, and there was no way to take it back. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he spat. "It's not what you think. It's just..." "Just what, Caleb?" I interrupted. "What was it then? A mistake? A one-time thing? Because if it was, why were you planning another trip? Why are you so cold to me, like you can't even look at me anymore?" His silence was all the answer I needed. "You don't care," I whispered, the words coming out broken, like I was speaking to myself. "You don't care about me. You never did." He opened his mouth again like he was going to say something, but I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want his lies. I didn't want his excuses. "I'm done, Caleb," I said, finally finding my voice. "I'm done." The words hit him like a slap. For a moment, he just stood there staring at me. But then he did something that I wasn't prepared for. Something I'll never forget. He laughed. It wasn't a real laugh. It wasn't a joke. It was bitter, cruel. It was like he was laughing at me. Like he was laughing at the idea that I thought he would ever care enough to fight for this. "I never wanted this," he said, his voice cold, almost bored. "I didn't want to hurt you, Maya, but you're suffocating me. Always demanding things, always needing me to be something I'm not." I couldn't breathe. The weight of his words crashed over me like a wave, pushing me down, making it hard to stay afloat. "So this was my fault?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You cheated on me, you lied to me, and it's my fault?" Caleb didn't respond. He didn't have to. The truth was already there, in the silence between us. I couldn't even look at him anymore. I couldn't stand to be in the same room with him. I turned away, my heart breaking with every breath. And just like that, the person I thought I knew, the person I thought I loved, was gone. He had never been the person I thought he was. He was someone else, someone I didn't even recognize. I walked away from him. Slowly, because I couldn't run. But with every step I knew, nothing would ever be the same again. After Caleb left, I was left alone, completely alone. I spent days in a haze, numb to everything around me. The house, once a place of comfort and warmth, now felt like a prison. Every corner of it reminded me of the lies, the promises he'd broken, the trust he'd shattered. It was like I couldn't breathe in there anymore. I couldn't escape the suffocating feeling that he had taken everything good with him. But the worst part? It wasn't even his absence. It was the way he acted, as if nothing had changed for him, like I was just some passing thing in his life that no longer mattered. I would have rather he had screamed, had fought for us. At least that would have shown that I meant something. Instead, he just left. He made his choice. And Alice, she was now his new everything. The messages, the hotel room, they weren't just mistakes. They were his new beginning. I tried to pick up the pieces of my life, but every time I started to rebuild, the weight of the truth dragged me back down. I couldn't focus at work. My performance crumbled as my thoughts consumed me. I would go to meetings, try to talk, but all I could hear in my head was Alice's name. Caleb's voice, so distant, so empty. One day, I got a call. It was from my boss. "Maya, we need to talk about your performance. We've been noticing a pattern lately, and it's not looking good." My heart sank. This was it. I could already feel the words coming. "We're going to have to let you go," my boss said flatly, as if it was just business. "We've been patient, but we can't keep you on like this." It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I had been trying. I had been pushing myself to hold it together, but I couldn't. The weight of Caleb's betrayal, of losing everything I thought I had, was too much. Now I was losing my job, too. Everything was slipping away, piece by piece. I hung up the phone and sat there, completely still. What was left? What was the point? Caleb had moved on. He had his new life with Alice. They were already planning their future together. Meanwhile, I was left with nothing but the remnants of a broken heart, a shattered career, and the ghost of a love I'd never truly known. And then, to make it even worse, Caleb did something I wasn't prepared for. He and Alice made their relationship public. One evening, out of nowhere, Caleb posted a picture of them together, smiling, holding hands. They were happy. They were everything I wasn't. I saw it online, and I froze. The image of them, so carefree, so in love, while I was here, broken and alone. But it wasn't just the post that shattered me. It was the caption, "Starting a new chapter with the person who makes me feel alive." I stared at the words, feeling like my heart had stopped. I wasn't just the one who was left behind. Caleb was rubbing it in my face. He was showing the world that he'd replaced me, that I was nothing to him now. That was the final blow. A few weeks later, I found out Caleb had gotten engaged to Alice. It was so fast, so sudden, like they had been planning it all along. I felt like I had been living in a dream. A nightmare, really. A nightmare where nothing was real anymore, where the person I thought I knew had never truly existed, where I was just a shadow, a passing phase in his life that he was quick to forget. I wanted to scream, to break everything around me, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed quiet. I stayed still. I just let the tears come when they came, let the emptiness wash over me when I couldn't hold it back anymore. Caleb had moved on, and I was left picking up the pieces of a life I would never get back. And no matter how hard I tried, no matter how many times I looked for something to hold on to, the truth was inescapable. He didn't love me. He never did. And somehow that hurt more than anything.